Rishi Sunak stopped short of announcing any new financial packages for the estimated 3 million people who've not qualified for any kind of help throughout the pandemic. Those working in creative industries, construction, events have been the hardest hit, with many self-employed workers or directors of limited companies, as we just heard there, also being affected. Let's speak to John Caudwell, business leader, philanthropist, founder of Phones for You, who's lending his support to the 3 million excluded. John, good to have you on with us again, sir. I hope you're well. I mean, this is an incredibly distressing picture, and we can't really understate the emphasis on this, the 3 million excluded, that word excluded, because it really is exactly that.
It is exactly that. Yes, it's quite devastating. When you see some of the ways that people are being caught out, for instance, if their self-employment produced over £50,000 a year, what an arbitrary number that is, because the furlough applies to anybody on any sort of wage at all. Okay, it's capped at the 2,500, but it's not eliminated as per the self-employed. Now, the irony is that the self-employed that are earning more than £50,000 may have a lot of direct overheads that are directly attributable to the running of the business, which enables them to make the 50,000. So they would actually need a bigger allowance than a furloughed person, not a smaller. So it's not very well thought through, I'm afraid, like a lot of these policies that the government put in. They seem to lack real world and real life experience, and they dream up these schemes and these rules from offices without having any real sense of reality and what goes on the ground. And it's very, very frustrating. It's frustrating for me. But of course, for the people that it affects, it's devastating.
Yeah. I mean, this is the difference between, survival and not survival. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of those 3 million, let's be frank about it, some of those 3 million will be reasonably well off and will be coping perfectly adequately, maybe not being treated fairly, but will be coping and getting through this. But there's going to be a percentage of those 3 million that, again, the lives are being devastated by this. The businesses are being devastated, and it'll take them many years to recover. And in some cases, of course, perhaps not at all, because the stress may have caused so much damage to their family lives that recovery won't be possible.
Yeah, for many people, a few people getting in touch with us, John, saying, what makes this perhaps slightly more curious is that this is a Conservative government. And Alexander Clark emails me and says, I always thought the Conservatives were supporters of business and the like, but unfortunately keep refusing to acknowledge huge numbers of hard-working, tax-paying voters. And there is something in that, isn't there? You sort of wouldn't expect it from the Conservatives.
No, the funny thing is that, or the strange thing about this is, any government can make mistakes. But if you've made a mistake and you've had it drawn to your attention, and this has been drawn to the government's attention many, many, many times, and there's even an All-Parliamentary Group making a presentation tomorrow again, and it must be on the government's radar screen. It must be, because there's so much noise about it. So to then not put it right, I find extremely puzzling. And even if they're only were doing it for manipulative reasons, thinking, well, a lot of those 3 million people will be Conservative Party supporters, and if we don't do something for them, they won't be voting for us next time. So even if they just did it out of self-interest, but it's not
not even that.
No, it's not that, because as so many people, well, one or two people have said, and they're absolutely right, that the government are responsible for distributing our tax dollars amongst the community in the fairest and most appropriate way. I'm one of the biggest taxpayers in the UK, or perhaps in the past have been the biggest. And for that tax money not to be finding its way into people's lives who are being devastated and who are not being treated commensurately and fairly compared to the rest of the population, is just blatantly wrong and has to be put right.
What do you sense the mood music might be then? It's very hard to tell and to know what the Rishi and Boris are thinking of. But I mean, it would seem extraordinary to me that this, as you've just alluded to, John, this hasn't come under their radar. I mean, this must come up for discussion at some point. There's 3 million people who are absolutely devastated by this.
I really cannot imagine, other than the fact that there's a cost to it, and the government are clearly concerned about the carrying on borrowing more and more and more money. But as a percentage of the total borrowing and the total damage done to the economy, looking after those, whatever proportion of those 3 million need looking after, wouldn't be the end of the world for the cost. But regardless of that, the fairness comes in. We have to treat people properly. We have to have a fairness in society. We have to have everybody thinking that they've been looked after appropriately. And even if it's not as well as they'd like to be looked after, at least fairly and appropriately. And then people might still complain, but I, for one, would be able to say, well, that's reasonable, it's fair, and I won't support that cause because you are being fairly treated, even though it's not as much as you'd like. I really just don't know. I am at a loss because the Conservative Party are shooting themselves in the foot. I have written to Boris, actually, another letter, and I've addressed it to him, and it's going to go to his desk hopefully sometime later this week and early next week. And I've written on various guises. One is, as a supporter of the Conservative Party and wanting to see the Conservative Party do the right thing by society. The other is to encourage them to respond, because if they don't, they're not going to win the next election. And of course, the main point being, it's just blatantly unfair at the moment. It's blatantly unfair.
Have you had any response from anybody on this?
Well, yes, I do get responses, because I wrote to Boris on CPR, on Caudwell Pandemic Recovery, whereby I'm advocating the borrowing and the spend of another half a trillion, so 500 billion, up to 1 trillion invested in the economy over the next few years to create jobs, to create GDP growth, and to create wealth, so that we don't actually end up having to finance this fiasco of the pandemic out of austerity, so that we can finance it out of GDP growth and out of success. And let's breed a whole new era of Britain's great success in the future, rather than sit there bemoaning what's happened to us.
I agree, John. It's great thought. Let's hope that people within the corridors of power are listening and act on at least some of this. Thank you, John Caudwell, business leader, a philanthropist. Of course, he's the guy that founded Phones for You and feels incredibly strongly about this. It's worth noting, by the way, that I don't know if it's still the case, but John paid, what was the figure? He paid 66 times more tax than Google for about 7 years. I think he was the UK's biggest taxpayer.